In the rugged heart of the Old West, where fortunes were gambled and lives were forged in fire, there lived a man of the mountains, a man known for his solitary ways, his keen eye, and a spirit as untamed as the wilderness he called home. But even the strongest mountains hold secrets, and sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the greatest treasures. This is the story of Caleb Stone, a hardened trapper, and the woman he won at a poker table, a woman whispered to be worthless, yet who held a secret that would forever change his world, and yours. Prepare for a tale of resilience, love, and the silent strength that blooms in the most desolate of places. Before we delve into this incredible journey of the human spirit, take a moment to become part of our Ridge family. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter of these forgotten tales. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever found unexpected value where others saw none? Your insights enrich our community. The wind whipped through Blackwood Creek, carrying the scent of pine smoke in desperation. It was a settlement clinging to the edge of civilization, a place where dreams arrived tattered and often left broken. Caleb Stone, broad-shouldered and weathered like an ancient oak, tied his horse, Buck, near the general store. His buckskins were worn, his face etched with the lines of countless winters spent in the unforgiving high country. He needed supplies: salt, flour, traps, and shot, things that kept a man alive when the snow fell deep and the silence grew heavy. Inside the Blackwood Saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the clatter of poker chips. Caleb usually avoided such places. They were breeding grounds for trouble, for men who talked too much and trusted too little. But tonight, a strange energy hummed through the room, a tension that wasn't just about money. As he waited for the storekeeper to return, he found himself drawn to a table in the back. 4 men sat around it, their faces grim. And then Caleb saw her. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, stood quietly by the dealer. Her dress was simple, faded but clean. Her gaze was downcast, her hands clasped. She wasn't playing, she was the stake. Her name's Selah, a gruff voice slurred. Just arrived, no kin, no coin, useless mouth to feed. We're playing for her passage out of here, or, well, you know. Caleb's gut twisted. He'd seen desperate games, but never one like this. He watched as a hand was dealt, the betting tense. The dealer, a man with a scarred cheek, grinned. Last hand, boys. Winner takes the burden. Caleb felt a strange pull, not of desire, but of a deep, unsettling responsibility. He was a man of the wilderness, not of society's tangled webs. Yet something in Selah's quiet dignity, her complete stillness amidst the crude remarks, caught him. He pulled out a pouch of gold dust, more than he'd intended to spend on supplies. "Deal me in," his voice a low rumble that cut through the smoky air. The room fell silent. One hand, winner takes all. The dealer smirked, and the cards began to fly. Caleb played his hand, his eyes scanning the faces, but always returning to the silent woman. The pot grew. Then, with a slow reveal, Caleb laid down his cards. A full house, aces over kings. The room gasped. The scarred dealer slammed his fist on the table, but the rules were set. Caleb had won. He had won the worthless woman. The silence that followed was heavy, only broken by the crackle of the fire. Selah slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met his for the very first time. There was no fear, no gratitude, only a profound, unfathomable emptiness. Caleb knew in that moment his solitary life had just taken an unforeseen turn. He had no idea what he had truly gained or what he had lost. The silence in the saloon was suffocating. Caleb didn't stick around to listen to the hollow laughter of the men who had just traded a human life like a sack of grain. He simply nodded to the woman, Selah, and gestured toward the door. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even look back at the people who had cast her aside. The cold night air hit them like a physical blow as they stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. Caleb led the way to his pack horse. He was a man who lived by the logic of the wild. Every ounce of weight mattered, and every mouth to feed had to be accounted for. To his fellow mountain men, bringing a woman into the high country was a recipe for disaster. But as he looked at her thin frame, he felt a strange sense of duty. "Can you ride?" Caleb asked, his voice rough from days of disuse. Selah gave a single sharp nod. She climbed onto the spare horse with a grace that surprised him. There was no whining about the cold, no plea for a hotel room. They rode out of Blackwood Creek under the silver light of a crescent moon, the only sound the rhythmic clopping of hooves on the frost-hardened earth. As they began the steep ascent toward the ridge, the trail narrowed. This was the edge of the world, where the civilized law of the valleys faded and the ancient laws of nature took over. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye. Most city folks would be trembling at the shadows of the towering pines, but Selah sat straight, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. To make the journey safer, Caleb began to speak, not just to fill the silence, but to teach. In these mountains, knowledge was the difference between life and death. "Keep your eyes on the horse's ears," Caleb told her. "They'll hear a shift in the brush long before you see it. And never grip the reins too tight. A horse needs to feel the ground to keep its footing on these scree slopes." As the elevation rose, the air grew thin and biting. Caleb pulled a heavy wool blanket from his pack and handed it to her. For a fleeting second, their fingers brushed. Her skin was ice cold, but her grip was like iron. She wrapped the wool around her shoulders, and for the first time a small spark of something, perhaps recognition, flickered in her stormy eyes. They were miles from the nearest cabin now, climbing into a realm of granite and ice. Caleb knew the rumors back in town, that she was broken, that she was a burden, but as he watched her navigate the treacherous ledge without a word of fear, he realized the men in that saloon hadn't seen her at all. They had only seen a reflection of their own cruelty. As the first light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of violet and gold, Caleb pulled his horse to a halt. The trail ahead had vanished under a fresh dusting of snow. He looked back at Selah, wondering if she would finally break. Instead, she pointed toward a subtle break in the timber, a path hidden to most, but clear to those who knew how to look. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. How did a worthless town girl know a hidden hunter's trail?
The sun hadn't quite cleared the peaks when the sky turned a bruised, heavy gray. In the mountains, the weather doesn't give warnings, it gives ultimatums. Caleb looked at the gap in the timber Selah had pointed out. It was a game trail, narrow and steep, but it offered the quickest route to a natural rock overhang he knew of. "The wind is shifting," Caleb grunted, checking the sky. "When the air smells like wet slate, the snow's coming fast. We can't make the cabin by nightfall. We hole up here." Educational value is often found in the quietest moments of survival. As the first flakes began to swirl, Caleb showed Selah how to choose a site. You never camp at the very bottom of a draw. That's where the coldest air settles and where runoff turns to ice. You find the thermal belt, halfway up the slope, tucked under the lee side of the ridge. They reached the limestone overhang just as the visibility dropped to a few yards. The world turned white and roaring. Caleb moved with a practiced efficiency of a man who had cheated death a dozen times. He began to gather fallen branches, but Selah didn't stand idly by. Without being asked, she began stripping the dry inner bark from a dead cedar tree. "Good," Caleb muttered, watching her. "Cedar bark is nature's tinder. Even when the world is soaking wet, that inner heart stays dry enough to catch a spark." He struck his flint and steel. The rhythmic clink, clink, clink echoed against the stone until a spark finally took hold in the cedar nest Selah had prepared. As the flame grew, Caleb built a reflector wall of stacked rocks behind the fire. This wasn't just for aesthetics. The stones would absorb the heat and radiate it back into the shallow cave, creating a pocket of warmth against the mountain's frozen breath. As they sat by the growing fire, the roar of the blizzard outside seemed to pull the walls of the cave closer. Caleb pulled out a small pot to melt snow for water. "Never eat raw snow to stay hydrated," he cautioned, his voice low. "It lowers your core temperature too fast. Melt it first, always." Selah nodded, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. The firelight played across her face, softening the harsh lines of her exhaustion. For the first time since they left the saloon, she seemed to relax, if only by a fraction. She reached into the small bundle she had carried from town and pulled out a handful of dried herbs. She dropped them into the boiling water, and a sharp medicinal scent filled the cave, willow bark and dried rose hips. Caleb frowned. Where'd a town girl learn to forage for willow? That's for pain and for the heart. Selah looked at him, the orange glow of the fire reflecting in her pupils. She didn't speak, but she pushed the cup toward him. Her hands, he noticed, were not the soft hands of a lady of leisure. They were calloused, with faint silver scars across the knuckles, the marks of someone who had worked the earth, or perhaps someone who had fought for every inch of ground she ever stood on. As the storm screamed outside, Caleb realized the worthless woman wasn't just surviving the mountain, she seemed to belong to it. But as she curled up near the heat of the rocks, she let out a soft, jagged breath that sounded like a name he couldn't quite catch, a name from a life she was trying to bury under the mountain snow.
The morning broke with a silence so profound it felt heavy. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world draped in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. Caleb rose before the sun, his joints popping like dry kindling. He looked over at Selah. She was already awake, sitting cross-legged by the embers, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first light of dawn was turning the snow into a field of diamonds. "We move now. The snow is fresh. It'll be deep in the drifts, but the crust hasn't iced over yet. It's the easiest travel we'll get." The final push to the ridge was a grueling test of endurance. In the Old West, homesteading wasn't just a dream, it was a daily battle against gravity and cold. Caleb led the horses, breaking trail. He showed Selah how to step in his tracks to save her energy, a vital lesson in mountain travel. "Conserve your breath," he coached. "In this thin air, your heart works twice as hard. Let the horse do the thinking. You just do the balancing." By midday, they reached the summit of the ridge. Nestled in a grove of ancient, wind-twisted pines sat Caleb's cabin. It was a humble structure of hand-hewn logs, chinked with moss and clay. To most, it looked lonely, even bleak, but to a man like Caleb, it was a fortress. As they crossed the threshold, the smell of old wood and dried herbs greeted them. The cabin was sparse, a bed of furs, a heavy oak table, and a massive stone hearth. Caleb expected Selah to wilt, to cry at the isolation of a life miles from the nearest human soul. Instead, she walked to the center of the room and closed her eyes, taking a long, deep breath. It was as if she were finally tasting clean air for the first time in years. Within the hour, the worthless woman had found the broom made of bound twigs and was sweeping the dust from the floorboards. She moved with a quiet, deliberate efficiency. Caleb watched as she inspected his stores. She didn't just look at the food, she checked the seal on the jars and organized the dried meat by age. "I don't expect a servant," Caleb said, feeling a strange need to defend his solitude. "You're a guest until the spring thaws the passes." Selah stopped. She looked at the rough-hewn walls, then at Caleb. She picked up a small piece of charcoal from the hearth and on a scrap of discarded parchment drew a single perfect symbol, an anchor entwined with a mountain lily. It was a mark of high craftsmanship, a signature of someone trained in the arts or the sciences. As she turned back to the hearth to start the evening fire, Caleb noticed a small leather-bound book tucked deep inside her tattered cloak. It wasn't a Bible or a diary. It looked like a ledger, one filled with names, dates, and figures that suggested Selah Thorne wasn't just a woman who had been won. She was a woman who was hiding a fortune or a debt that could burn the entire ridge to the ground. The days on the ridge fell into a rhythmic, taxing labor. In the high country, survival isn't a single event. It's a series of small, disciplined choices. Caleb spent his mornings checking the perimeter and preparing for the deep freeze. He watched Selah closely, waiting for the moment her city-bred spirit would snap. But it never did. Instead, she seemed to be reclaiming a part of herself that the world below had tried to crush. Educational value in the 1800s often came down to preservation. Caleb spent one afternoon showing Selah how to render tallow from animal fat. "You don't waste a thing up here," he explained, his voice softening. "Fat isn't just for food. It's for candles, for waterproofing your boots, and for keeping your skin from cracking in the dry mountain wind. To live here, you must respect the animal that gave its life for yours." Selah listened with an intensity that unsettled him. She was a quick study, her hands moving with a precision that didn't match the worthless label she'd been given. But it was in the evenings, by the low amber glow of the hearth, that the ghosts began to stir. One night, as Caleb was sharpening his skinning knife, he noticed Selah feeing by the small window, staring into the blackness of the pines. The leather-bound book she carried was open in her lap. She wasn't reading it. She was tracing the lines of the pages with a trembling finger. Caleb caught a glimpse of the ledger. It wasn't filled with poetry. It was filled with chemical formulas and botanical sketches, details of rare ores and the refining process of silver. "That's a lot of weight for a woman to carry," Caleb said quietly. Selah froze. She slowly closed the book, her knuckles white. For the first time, the silence between them felt heavy with a different kind of pressure. She looked at him, and in the flickering firelight he saw a flash of raw, unfiltered fear. "They didn't want me for the work I couldn't do, Caleb," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken more than a single word, and her voice was like a cello, rich, haunting, and cracked with emotion. "They wanted me for what I knew. And when I wouldn't give it to them, they called me broken until the whole town believed it." She stood up, walking toward the fire. She held the book over the flames for a long, agonizing second. Caleb didn't move. He realized then that the worthless wife was actually a woman who held the keys to a kingdom, a secret so valuable that men would kill to possess it. "The man who sold me at that table," she said, her voice dropping to a ghost of a sound, "wasn't a stranger. He was my guardian, and he's not the type of man who stays lost for long." The fire crackled, a sharp pop of pine sap echoing like a gunshot in the small cabin. Selah pulled the book back from the heat, clutching it to her chest. The admission hung in the air, thick and heavy. Caleb didn't press her. In the mountains, you don't dig into a man's past, or a woman's, any more than you dig into a hornet's nest. You judge them by the wood they haul and the way they hold their ground. "The wind on this ridge blows hard enough to scour the skin off a man," Caleb said, his voice a steady anchor. "But it also blows away the scent of a trail. If he's coming, he'll have to find us first, and the mountain doesn't give up its guests easily." The following weeks turned into a master class in mountain living. Selah seemed driven by a new, frantic energy. She wanted to learn everything. Caleb showed her the language of the ridge, the subtle signs that told a story to those who knew how to read them. He taught her that a sudden silence among the mountain jays meant a predator was near, and that the way the moss grew on the north side of the hemlocks was a natural compass that never failed. There is a profound educational value in the Old West's relationship with the land.
Caleb took her to a frozen stream and showed her how to identify sweet birch. If you scraped the bark, it smelled of wintergreen and could be brewed into a tea to break a fever. He showed her the old man's beard lichen hanging from the branches, explaining its use as a natural antiseptic for wounds. "The earth provides the cure for the hardships it gives," he told her. "You just have to be humble enough to look at the dirt." As they worked, the barrier began to dissolve. Selah started sharing her own knowledge, though she did so through action rather than words. She showed Caleb how to mix wood ash with fat to create a better soap, and how to use the charcoal from their fire to filter the spring water, making it as clear as melted glass. One afternoon, while they were gathering fallen timber, Caleb stopped and looked at her. Her face had filled out, her eyes were bright with a keen, sharp intelligence, and she moved with a confidence that had been entirely absent at the poker table. She wasn't a burden or a worthless prize, she was a partner. But the mountain has a way of reminding you of your mortality. As they reached the edge of a steep ravine, Caleb pointed toward the northern pass. The sky there was an unnatural, bruised yellow. "The great freeze is coming," he warned, "the kind that can crack a stone in half." Just as he turned to lead them back to the cabin, a low, rhythmic thudding vibrated through the ground. It wasn't the wind, it was the sound of several horses struggling through the deep drifts at the base of the ridge. Selah's face went bone white. The past wasn't just echoing anymore, it was knocking on the door.
The vibration in the earth was unmistakable. To an untrained ear, it might have been the shifting of snow, but to Caleb, it was the heavy, rhythmic beat of iron-shod hooves. He looked at Selah. The color had drained from her lips, her hands instinctively clutching the hidden ledger beneath her furs. The hunters had arrived, but the mountain was about to provide a defense they hadn't bargained for. "Get to the cabin," Caleb commanded, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "If the yellow sky holds true, we have 10 minutes before the air turns to needles." The yellow sky was a rare atmospheric phenomenon, a dead air pocket that preceded a flash freeze. In the 1800s, mountain men feared this more than any predator. When the barometric pressure drops this sharply, moisture in the air crystallizes instantly. If you are caught in the open, the very breath in your lungs can cause internal damage. As they scrambled back toward the cabin, the wind died down to an eerie, suffocating calm. The horses at the bottom of the ridge began to whinny in terror. They felt it too. But Caleb, in his haste to secure the heavy oak door, stepped onto a patch of black ice hidden beneath a dusting of powder. His lead leg buckled. A sickening crack echoed against the timber, not the sound of a branch breaking, but of bone. Caleb went down, a grunt of agony escaping his teeth. He tried to rise, but his right leg was useless, pinned at an angle that made his vision swim with white sparks. "Caleb!" Selah was at his side in an instant. "Leave me," he wheezed, the yellow light of the sky deepening into an apocalyptic bronze. "The freeze! Get inside, Selah! Close the flue! You know how to survive now!" But the woman the world called worthless didn't move toward safety. Instead, she did something Caleb never expected. She reached into her pack and pulled out a length of sturdy hemp rope and a pair of smooth cedar slats she had been carving for crates. With a calmness that bordered on the supernatural, she began to construct a traction splint, a piece of frontier medicine that required both engineering and a steady hand. She didn't panic. She used a Spanish windlass technique, looping the rope and using a stick to twist it, creating tension that aligned the bone and eased the muscle spasms. It was a sophisticated medical maneuver, far beyond the knowledge of a simple town girl. As the first wall of the flash freeze hit, a literal wave of white fog that turned everything it touched into brittle glass, Selah threw her shoulder under Caleb's arm. She was half his size, but her resolve was a physical force.
With a guttural cry of effort, she dragged the mountain man across the threshold just as the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single heartbeat. She slammed the door and dropped the heavy bar. Outside, the world turned into a frozen tomb. Inside, the man who had won her lay gasping on the floor, looking up at the woman whose secret was far more than just a book of numbers. She wasn't just a scholar, she was a healer who had been forbidden to heal.
The cabin walls groaned as the wood contracted in the sudden, violent cold. Outside, the world was a monochromatic void, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and the heavy, ragged breathing of two people who had just cheated death. Caleb lay on the furs, his face slick with a cold sweat. The pain in his leg was a dull, thrumming roar, but his mind was sharp, fixed on the woman who had just saved his life with the precision of a surgeon. Salah moved through the cabin with a quiet authority that had replaced her former submissiveness. She didn't just stoke the fire, she managed the ventilation to ensure the oxygen remained rich while the heat stayed trapped. This was the chimney effect, a vital piece of frontier physics. By adjusting the damper just so, she created a steady draw that prevented carbon monoxide buildup while maximizing the caloric output of the dry pine logs. "You're more than a bookkeeper, Salah," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking. "That splint, that wasn't a guess, that was medicine." Salah sat by his side, her hands finally trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. She reached for the leather-bound book, but she didn't open it to the pages of silver and ore. She flipped to the back, where the sketches were of human anatomy and the intricate networks of veins and nerves. "My father was a doctor in the East. He believed that knowledge belonged to those who could use it, regardless of who they were. He taught me everything. But when he passed, the men who took over his practice didn't want a woman who knew the truth of their failures. They wanted a scapegoat. They took my inheritance, my name, and finally, my voice. They told the world I was touched and worthless, a burden to be traded away." She looked at Caleb, and for the first time, the breathless secret was laid bare. She wasn't hiding a fortune of silver in the ground. She was hiding a fortune of knowledge in her mind. She was a pioneer of medicine in a time when women were barely allowed to read. The man at the saloon, he knew. He didn't want to sell me. He wanted to break me so I would finally sign over the patents my father left behind. He's not just a gambler, Caleb. He's a man who builds empires on the bones of others. Educational value in the Old West often came from these hidden intellectuals, people whose contributions were erased by history. Salah explained how she had been using the willow bark tea and the old man's beard, not just out of habit, but because she understood the salicin and usnic acid within them. She was a bridge between the ancient wisdom of the earth and the burgeoning science of the future. But as she finished her story, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind, a rhythmic, metallic scraping against the cabin door. Someone was clearing the ice from the threshold. The great freeze had stopped the horses, but it hadn't stopped the greed of the man who was coming to reclaim his property.
The scraping sound against the heavy oak door was cold and deliberate, the sound of iron against ice. Caleb reached for his belt, but his injured leg flared with a white-hot reminder of his helplessness. He looked at Selah. The woman who had spent months in silence now stood tall, her eyes no longer reflecting the stormy sky, but the tempered steel of the ridge itself. "He won't stop, Caleb," she whispered. "Men like Julian Vance don't see people. They see assets. They see leverage." The bar on the door rattled as a heavy shoulder threw itself against the wood. A muffled voice called out from the frost, slick and confident. "Selah, I know you're in there, and I know the mountain man is broken. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just hand over the ledger, and I'll leave you both to the winter." Caleb looked at the fireplace, then at the various bundles of dried herbs and minerals Selah had collected. In the Old West, survival wasn't always about force. It was about the clever application of the resources at hand. This is the true educational heart of the frontier, the chemistry of the cabin. "Selah," Caleb groaned, pushing himself up on one elbow. "The flour, the fine ground limestone by the hearth, and the bellows." Selah understood instantly. In a confined space, a high concentration of organic dust, like flour, can become a powerful tool for deterrence when introduced to a heat source. It's a phenomenon known as a dust flash. She didn't want to cause harm. She wanted to create a barrier of light and pressure that would force a retreat. She moved with the grace of a woman who had mastered her own fear. She didn't open the door. Instead, she spoke through the heavy timber. "Julian, you called me worthless. You said I was a burden. But the mountain has taught me that nothing is without value. Not the dirt, not the weeds, and certainly not me." As the door finally groaned and the latch began to give way, Selah didn't cower. She took the bellows and aimed them at a heap of fine powder she had positioned near the hearth's draught. As the door swung open, revealing the frost-covered figure of Vance, she squeezed. A cloud of white billowed into the air, catching the orange glow of the fire. The result was a sudden, harmless but terrifyingly bright flash of golden light and a localized gust of wind that blew the intruders back into the snow, blinded by the sheer brilliance. It was a demonstration of the very science they had tried to steal from her, a secret turned into a shield. In the confusion and the blinding light, Selah stepped to the threshold. She didn't use a weapon. She simply held up the ledger, then threw it into the heart of the fire. "The knowledge is mine, Julian," she cried out over the wind. "It's in my head, not on the paper, and you will never, ever own me again." The silence that followed was only broken by the crackling of the paper as it turned to ash. The worthless wife had just burned a fortune to save her soul.
The embers of the ledger drifted up the chimney like a swarm of fireflies, disappearing into the cold mountain night. Julian Vance and his men, shaken by the flash and humbled by a woman who had finally found her fire, retreated into the shadows of the timber. They knew that on this ridge, Selah Thorne was no longer a victim. She was the master of her domain. As the door was barred once more, a profound peace settled over the cabin. The great freeze outside continued to howl, but inside the atmosphere had shifted. Caleb looked at Selah, his eyes filled with a new kind of reverence. He realized then that the poker game at Blackwood Creek hadn't been a matter of luck. It had been a moment of destiny. "You burned it all," Caleb said softly, his hand finding hers. "The silver, the patents, the life you were supposed to have." Selah sat beside him on the edge of the firs, her face glowing in the soft light of the hearth. "No, Caleb, I burned the chains. The life I'm supposed to have is right here." As the weeks passed and the winter began to lose its grip, the cabin on the ridge transformed. It became a place of healing. Caleb's leg mended, guided by Selah's expert care and her knowledge of the mountain's pharmacy. But more than that, they built a life based on mutual respect and shared wisdom. They became a living testament to the educational value of the frontier, that survival is not just about the strength of one's back, but the brilliance of one's mind and the resilience of one's heart. The man of the mountains and the woman the world had discarded created a legacy that wasn't written in ledgers, but in the soil they tended and the lives they touched. They were no longer a trapper and a prize. They were Stone and Thorne, a family forged in the harshest of winters.
proving that the most worthless things in the eyes of the world are often the very things that save us.
Thank you for journeying with us to the high country of the Old West. Selah and Caleb's story reminds us that our true value isn't determined by what others say, but by the strength we find within ourselves when the winter winds blow hardest. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear a tale of redemption. To ensure you never miss a moment of Rescued by the Ridge, hit that subscribe button and join our community of storytellers. I want to hear from you. What did you think of Selah's breathless secret? Let me know in the comments below. If you're hungry for more tales of survival and love, check out our Old West playlist on the screen now. Until next time, stay brave, stay kind, and may you find your own ridge of peace. Be well.